Welcome to the Darkstream. I'm VoxDay, voxday.blogspot.com. Welcome to the Reprehensibles, the VFM, the Dread Ilk, and, of course, the Bears. I was listening to Owen's stream earlier, and it was very interesting because he was talking about, of course, a very controversial subject. He was talking about little men with little hats, and he was talking about the fact, or really the observation, that the United States is essentially a colony at this point. Not of Israel, despite what people tend to assume, but rather the diaspora of the Jewish nation. And there's that old saying, I think it was Voltaire, you know who your rulers are because that's who you're not allowed to criticize. And it's interesting because who can't be criticized in the UK? The Blairites and the new independent group are going really hard after Jeremy Corbyn. They're claiming that he's anti-Semitic or that he's too friendly with anti-Semites and so forth. Now, what's interesting about this from the US perspective is that Jeremy Corbyn is a very hardcore leftist. In the States, what do the Cucks do? What do the Jordan Petersons do? What do the Ben Shapiros do? They always say, oh, it's the left, it's the left, it's the left. The left is bad. We're not left. They're bad. And yet, if you look at the situation in the UK, the left is being subject to the exact same treatment that the American right, the US right, the Republicans have been subjected to. This is where it starts to get interesting. Because what we're seeing is that it is nothing about ideology. Ideology is dead. The whole left versus right thing is dead. All we have left are the identity politics, which the little men with little hats have been practicing since 1920. And how does this connect to what I'm talking about? How does this connect to the end of empires? Let me read you a quote from Infogalactic/Wikipedia. It's the same on both sites. It's about a period of time in the Roman Empire called the Crisis of the 3rd Century. Now, the image I picked is actually well before that, but that image there is the Romans being forced to march under the yoke in a gesture of submission to the victorious Helvetii. Now, this happened before the empire. This happened under the Roman Republic, and Caesar subsequently avenged that defeat. But I thought it was a interesting and reasonable image to talk about the end of empires, because although that wasn't the end of the Roman Empire, excuse me, there will be more. Although it wasn't the end of the Roman Empire, what it represented was the end. It was something that happened at the end of the Roman Republic. Muffhead says he's going to watch this later. Love to you and your family. Likewise. You be well as well. So, the crisis of the 3rd century was also known as the military anarchy or the imperial crisis, AD 235 to 284. It was a period in which the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under the combined pressures of barbarian invasions and migrations into Roman territory, civil wars, peasant rebellions, political instability with multiple usurpers competing for power, growing influence and Roman reliance on barbarian mercenaries, and commanders nominally working for Rome but increasingly independent, plague, debasement of the currency, and economic depression. The crisis began with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own troops in 235, initiating a 50-year period during which there are at least 26 claimants to the title of emperor, mostly prominent Roman army generals who assumed imperial power over all or part of the empire. By 268, the empire had split into 3 competing states: the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, including the eastern provinces of Syria and Egypt, and the Italian-centered and independent Roman Empire proper between them. Later, Aurelian reunited the empire. The crisis ended with the ascension and reforms of Diocletian in 284. And this, of course, is what set the stage for the ascendance of Constantine the Great and the eventual split into the Eastern and Roman empires. And so, if you think about it, you think about what they're talking about with regards to the near collapse of the empire. Look at the description of what was happening. Migrations into Roman territory, political instability, economic depression, plague, debasement of the currency. They might as well be describing the USA today. Nuclear Pizza says, always good to join you for your nightly commentary and sneezing fit. I think it's the light, honestly. And so when you're looking at the situation, you say, okay, how does this happen? How did this situation come about? What created this situation? And what has happened, what has changed, is 2 things. Number 1, the United States became the number 1 global power. It became the only global superpower. And secondly, there's 3 things actually. It rejected its roots as a Christian nation. Regardless of what uneducated and dishonest ignoramuses say, it doesn't say anything about Christianity in the Constitution. The United States was described as a Christian nation by the U.S. Supreme Court until 1930. So if you look at that second factor, it's actually the second and third factors are actually related, because the third factor is the massive immigration into the United States. And so what I think is clearly the most significant element that changed is the immigration, the mass immigration of non-Christians, specifically Jews, in the early 20th century. And that's where we see all this propaganda. That's where we see all this false stuff about Judeo-Christianity being pushed in the post-war period. That's where we see this whole cult of Holocaustianity being erected and used to try to guilt and shame people 70 years after the events of it, which is totally ridiculous. And the birth of the nation of Israel in 1948, which is interesting because what you see is over time, and it's very clear when you look at the history of it, you need to remember there's a difference between the Zionists and the diaspora. Two different groups. People who claim that Jews are Jews are Jews are wrong. Look up the way that the rabbinical Jews all but eradicated the Karaite Jews. Look at the way that there's a lot of debate in Israel over the way that the Ashkenazi have treated the Sephardic majority at times. Is there a way to view the transcript for the Should Women Vote debate you were in? Not that I'm aware of. Frank Underwood said, should not the Americans welcome the fall of the empire? Well, that's what we're going to get to. The longer it takes before the collapse, the worse the conflict and misery will become. I think that you can go farther than that, but we'll get to that, because what we've seen here is that the Roman Empire over time ceased to be Roman. And this is normal, just so you understand. This is normal for all empires. If you look at the Chinese empires, how many of them were actually Chinese? A number of them, when they talk about the Indian empires, you have the Mughals, who, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but they were essentially Mongol imports. The Chinese also had Mongolian emperors, and then they had the later dynasty that also wasn't Chinese. And so what we're seeing is that, first of all, the U.S. is an empire. The U.S. has been an empire established by force, ruling over a separate nations, at least since 1865. The Civil War marked the end of the Republic. People just didn't really realize it or recognize it because they maintained the trappings of the Republic that preceded it. But it was no longer a voluntary association. Jacob says, hey Vox, thanks for helping me challenge my assumptions and helping me find Christ again. I know you're non-denominational, but I'm curious on your thoughts on the Orthodox versus the Protestant Church. First, I'm glad to hear that. Secondly, I don't really have any thoughts on that. I spend no time whatsoever thinking about the Orthodox Church, and I spend virtually no time thinking about Protestant denominations. Not an area of interest to me at all. So anyhow, when you look, the Manchu, that was the word I was looking for, the Manchu dynasty in China. And so it's important to keep in mind that, now see, Mark is missing the point. 1868, it went commie. It's not about ideology. Ideology has virtually nothing to do with it. Ideology is what separates a nation. Ideology involves the competing ideas, the competing abstract ideas that separate a nation. But we're not talking about a nation. The United States is not a nation. The United States is, and has been for over a century, an empire. And the fact that that empire became the most powerful empire on earth meant the same thing that happens in every empire. People are naturally drawn to power, and evil people are particularly drawn to power. And so it's normal that people will be drawn to it, and then attempt to rise up in it, and then attempt to utilize it for either their personal goals or for their to further the interests of their identity group. This is normal. This is what has happened over and over and over and over again. And so when you look at the way that the United States occupies Europe, Western Europe, it literally occupies Western Europe. Troops all over Germany, troops and bases all the way down through Italy. When you look at this, it's natural that different identity groups are going to attempt to utilize that power for their own benefit. Now, keep in mind that Israel did not do that when it was first founded. Many people don't realize that it was actually the Soviet Union that was providing Israel with most of its military goods and so forth. And because of the nature of its founding, Israel was in a modest form of war with the UK. In fact, I met a older British gentleman at an Anglican church in Europe, and he hated Israel. I mean, I don't think I'd ever met anyone who hated Israel specifically as much as this guy. And I asked him, why? And he said, my brother was killed by the Irgun, one of the Jewish terrorist gangs of before the establishment of the State of Israel, which later ended up becoming the roots of the Likud political party there. I think Menachem Begin was one of them, if I recall correctly. And because the British used to control that land, the whatever it was called, it was actually called the province of Palestine or whatever it was. And so these things are much more complicated and intertwined than a simple you hate X because because you're bigoted against Y. That's a remarkably foolish and ignorant way to look at any of this stuff. It's far more complicated. Hand-Drawn Bear says, Vox, do you think the Book of Ruth lays out a model for good immigrant behavior? On an individual basis, yes, but it's not really applicable to anything that we would describe as immigration. So, the Palestinian Mandate, that's correct. And no, Wulad, you that's not correct. He says Israelis hate Christians. That's not correct. Many of them don't. I work with Israelis, proud Israelis, and they think very well of Christians and Europe and so forth. Again, you can't exaggerate or lump everybody into one group or another. It's not a binary situation. I'll give you an example that I thought was really funny. When Martin Van Crevel, the great Israeli military historian, heard about what was going on with regards to the Hugo Awards back in 2015, he thought it was very funny. And I thought his response was even funnier because he emailed me and he included a link to a story about the situation that he'd come across somewhere. And his comment was, onward Christian soldiers. He was expressing his support for what we were doing. And, it's ludicrous to lump. It's as ludicrous to lump Israelis in a single group as it is to say that all Christians like or dislike X. It's just not true. But there are interests that nations have. And the Jewish nation is divided because increasingly the Israelis have different interests than the people who are still living in, foreign nations. And Jack Cool says, how can I go about dialectically challenging a Zionist Christian? Well, it depends on what it is that they're talking about. People say, Israel is, the Israelis are not the real Israel of the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. It seems to me that if you take a premillennial perspective, the fact that Israel was reestablished after 2,000 years does seem pretty miraculous. On the other hand, if you take that view, it's pretty obvious that those folks are going to rebuild the temple and then start worshiping the Antichrist. So, I think there's a lot of not just confusion. I mean, of course we don't understand. How can we understand the future, even if it's prophesied? But more importantly, how does it make sense to claim that Christians should be supporting the worship of the Antichrist? I mean, you can't immanentize the eschaton. Now, I don't believe that most intelligent or even unintelligent Christians think that they're bringing about the end times by helping fly Jews to Israel. That sounds... I'm sure there probably are some actual Christians who believe that, but that to me sounds like a media caricature of a Christianity that doesn't actually exist. I mean, yes, I grew up in a Baptist church that used to fly what they called the Christian flag, the United States flag, and the Israeli flag. Literally up on the platform, there were those three flags. The Christian flag was this white flag. It was designed kind of like a United States flag with the blue, corner. The rest of it was white, and then there was I think it was a yellow cross, a red or yellow cross. I think there was a red cross actually in the blue section. It was not a particularly attractive flag, but so they were pretty Zionistic in that way. But they never said, we need to do this in order to make Jesus come back sooner. It was ridiculous. The Bible says that no man knows the hour. So, Rob is correct. Ask Orthodox rabbis. They will tell you there's a reason they say Israel is not a legitimate nation and don't support them. Yeah, there's all kinds of divisions and so forth. Natural lifestyle, you're in way over your head. How can you call yourself intelligent and believe in God? Because I have a measured IQ of 150. Most people consider that to be intelligent. If you don't understand that intelligent people believe a lot of things that normal people think is crazy, you obviously have not had much contact with intelligent people. D. Hernandez says, I can still be a nationalist. No, as always, grateful for your stream book's existence in general. Of course you can be a nationalist. Sending love to you, your family, and your precious pups. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And so I suspect that when the U.S. empire finally collapses, that we are going to understand the significance of the way in which the empire was, the leadership of the empire was replaced by foreigners in much the same way that every other declining empire gets replaced by foreigners. And that's where the seeds of the destruction are not necessarily sown. They've probably been sown before that, because all things die in time. But I think that that's where we'll see that the end of the U.S. empire became inevitable. If the U.S. as an empire, is God Emperor Trump an actual emperor? In practice, yes. Can Trump win negotiations with Kim Jong-il? Well, he can. I don't know whether he will. It's not looking great now, but, never ever assume that, never count Trump out. Jay from NYC is correct. I used to think that conspiracy theorists were idiots until I realized I was the gullible idiot who believed that all people were as good as my own. Ron Stone says Vox is spot on. Senator Schumer has Israeli citizenship in addition to American. There's no question. Frank Underwood, do you think the EU will survive the empire's fall? No, I think the EU is going to, the breakup of the EU is going to precede it. I expect the USA to begin breaking apart in the 2033 timeframe. I don't think that the EU will last that long. Vox does like opera. And dual citizenship should be illegal for public officials. Dual citizenship should be completely illegal for everyone. A man cannot serve two masters. Owen asks a very important question when he says, who is your master? Riss says, what do you think is a valid path for American nationalists? Reform the U.S. or return to our heritage countries? You can't reform the U.S. And I don't think, depending on how long you've been in the U.S., I don't know, if you still speak the language, returning to your heritage country is probably a great idea. If you don't, then, you might as well work to build a new one. Jay from NYC. I'm dual British and American. I truly love both. It's not about what you love. It's about who you're loyal to in the end, because that's who you will serve. That's who you will benefit to the destruction or to the detriment of the other party. And so, the thing is, we can wish people well. We can wish others well without being them. And so, what we need to focus on doing now is attempting to anticipate the changes that are going to happen and attempt to rebuild to the best of our ability. What we're trying to do now is we're trying to plant seeds for the future. And that means having families. That means building families. One of the most interesting things about the history of empires is that if you look at their expansion, plateauing, and eventual decline and fall, you can see it happening in the familial structures of the native populations. It's not an accident now that most of the US and European political leadership is geriatric and childless. Look at Merkel, no kids. Look at Macron, no kids. It's just one of those things that becomes obvious over time when you look at it. In fact, they argue that one of the reasons for the advancement and the heights that Europe reached was because they had a eugenic structure where the wealthy, talented, aristocratic families used to have many more kids. They'd have 10 kids, where the impoverished, less talented, less intelligent lower classes would have far fewer that managed to survive. And that had a civilizational effect on the population. The population became smarter. The population became more capable and more functional. We are living in a period where the exact opposite's been happening. If you read the great brain books by John D. Fitzgerald, you can see the description of a society that is growing. Each of the families has, 4 kids, 6 kids. There's a tremendous community spirit, even crossing lines of religion, like the way that the Catholics, the Mormons, and the Protestants would all come together to build an academy in Aidenville and so forth. And this was a author drawing on his real life experiences. And yes, there's an element of the whole civic nationalism that has led to the, contributed to the rot of the empire. But you can see a confident, growing society. And that's not what we see now when young men are terrified to get married because they're afraid, they might lose some of their toys. It's ridiculous. I mean, you could lose a lot more than 20% of your income trying to move out west, marrying some immigrant from Norway who is 20 years younger than you. I mean, the risks that they were willing to take were so much higher. I mean, what's kind of funny to me about the paranoid Gen X and millennial men is I might get divorced and she might take some of my money. I mean, how great a risk is that compared to the risks that your forefathers regularly took? Whether they went to Vietnam, whether they enlisted in the Marines during World War II, whether they went out west and were dealing with Indian uprisings. There's a section in I think it's the 8th book, where they're literally terrified that the Paiute tribe, which has been ripped off and is being mistreated, are going to rise up and slaughter the entire town. How many of you feel like that's an actual risk today? But you're afraid that if you marry a woman and it goes bad, then a family court might take some of your stuff. That is not testimony to male courage. John Smith, any suggestions on speeding up the fall of the U.S.? Yeah, just vote for conservatives, vote for Democrats, and you'll get there real quick. C3 says, you don't just lose your toys. There's an extreme likelihood. No, you're a liar. You C3, you are a stupid liar. There is not an extreme likelihood. So what's that extreme likelihood? 95%? 87%? No, there's about a 0.001% that you will get thrown into prison and or be homeless for the rest of your life. I know plenty of guys who've gotten divorced. You know how many of them have been thrown into prison? None. Do you know how many are homeless for the rest of their lives? None. You're believing what the people who want to destroy your nation want you to believe. You know, you guys are cowards because you've accepted a false narrative. Let's see here, I missed... Tuan Trong says, birth rate of just 1.6 and a rapidly aging population. Is China going to suffer an IQ drop like the West, and will this lead to a weaker China century? No, I don't believe so, because they're not going to... They don't have the same dysgenic structures, and China has different issues. PS says, hope to hear predictions, analysis of what might happen when the U.S. military suffers a serious military defeat. It is something that is considered inconceivable by punditry politicians, most important event of our lives. Well, yeah, I was going to get to that, actually. You correctly anticipated me. Remember, there's a difference between events, like causal events, that can be very, very small, and the big visible events that make the consequences clear. So, to the extent that I can understand this history as it's happened and is happening and is going to happen, I think the most significant element in the decline and collapse of the USA is probably the decision to permit the large-scale immigration of the Jews. Again, there have been Jews living in the United States since before it was the United States. There's nothing wrong with small groups of people. Small groups of people don't affect things. But once you have a sufficiently large and capable interest group that begins agitating, advocating, and working towards its own interests rather than the interests of the native population of the nation, then you begin to see the actions of the government and the laws of the society begin to diverge from the interests of the nation. And that's what we've seen. Yeah, Tubercat's banned. I am not a boomer of any sort, and I've been down on boomers longer than most of you people who complain about boomers have been alive. That is like absolutely beyond the pale. I mean, see, this is why I have such contempt for millennials as a general rule. You guys are so astonishingly clueless that the first little bit of true information that you have, you cling to like Gollum to your precious. And you don't understand that it's just the first step. You don't understand that it's just the first step to much deeper and more complicated truths. Okay? I'm aware of literally everything that you've learned from Royce, from Rouge, from Chateau, etc. I know these guys personally. And so, so the idea that you are in your disagreement are telling me anything is totally fallacious. It's totally wrong. You're trying to win a war by running away. That will never, ever work. You have to go forward. You have to take the risks if you're going to win. Otherwise, you are going to not only lose, you're not even going to be in the fight. You're just basically submitting and surrendering. And so, Lord Mozart says, but are you technically a boomer? I'm 50, you moron. I'm nowhere nearly old enough to be a boomer. Does Byzantium count as an instance of the bad kind of thing you call an empire? Yeah, yes, it was the West or the Eastern Roman Empire. It was the Byzantine Empire. I don't have another name for it. An empire is an empire. An empire is a entity that rules over nations. And as Yuval Hazani puts it correctly, there is always a dominant nation that rules the empire for its benefit. And in the case of the United States, the nation that currently rules the U.S. empire for its benefit, the leading nation at the moment, is the diaspora Jewish nation. That's the current ruling nation of the U.S. empire. But they're influential rather than powerful. And that creates a problem. It intrinsically creates a problem because they're not numerous enough to hold power once the rifts that are endangering the stability of the empire begin to shake. And so, and the thing is that they know it. I mean, the intelligent ones do. Back in 2004, a group of Jewish leaders met at the plantation of Y to discuss what they should do when the whole situation begins to break apart. And so, I mean, keep in mind, because you occasionally, here's some good rhetoric for you, because occasionally you'll get a Jew, especially living in the U.S., saying, "Well, I'm American. I'm Jewish and American." It's like, really? You guys were living in Egypt for 400 years, and you still weren't Egyptian. And you're magically American just because your grandfather came over after surviving the Holocaust? It's nonsense. It's total nonsense. In fact, I always, people don't tend to argue with me much about this sort of thing because most of the people that actually know me understand that I know very well what I'm talking about. But it is kind of amusing to get them to try to deny that they're like, "Well, I'm not Egyptian." Well, how come you're not Egyptian? I mean, if you're American just because you're American, then you must be Egyptian because your ancestors lived in Egypt, right? I mean, it's the whole concept is nonsensical. You are what you are. You're the nation that you belong to is the nation that you were born into, and this is actually the interesting thing as nationalist consciousness rises, is that they're actually trying to say that a nation is where the one you're born into geographically. I mean, that's just a flat out lie, total lie. But I'm beginning to see people. I'm beginning to see people understand that that the definition of nationalism is important, and that's why we're seeing these false definitions being floated and being put forward. Let's see. Vox, I need to publish a work. We're not taking submissions right now. We're way too busy. I'm sorry. Anti-Evil Soldier says, "Do you think many white leftists want to lose?" Yes, I do. Lidsol says the U.S. is done. First women in Congress, then brown women, then brown Muslim women. It's over for the U.S. This should be a clear sign. It's been over since 2000. It's been observably over since 2004. I wrote a column about it saying you can't fix a corpse. But it's not the end of the world. What happens to empire when the world is confronted face to face with alien life? We actually probably see a bigger empire, depending on how friendly or unfriendly it is. You guys, it's a meme. Everyone that's not young is basically called a boomer online. Yeah, not here. You call me a boomer, you're getting banned instantly. Like I said, I've disliked boomers longer than you've been alive. I had to spend my entire life listening to boomers talk about themselves incessantly. I had to spend literally 20 years in Minnesota listening to that end of year show on KQ92 saying, and number one, for the 23rd year in a row, Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven. No, Ethnarch, we're not getting back to that. The subject is empires. The only reason that we're talking about the Little Men in Little Hats theme is because it's relevant to this particular empire. Okay? Feisty says, what do you make of Richard Spencer's pan-European imperialism? I think Richard Spencer's a moron. His pan-European imperialism is an absolute non-starter. It would theoretically work about as well as Nasser's pan-Arabism. It's a remarkably stupid idea that illustrates very clearly Richard Spencer's ignorance of history. Would Europeans ruling other nations paternalistically be a repeat of past mistakes? Yes, that's what we called the colonial era. Didn't work out so well for them, did it? Do Hapas have a place in America? No, they're not American. There's going to be we don't know where the boundaries are going to be. It's not up to me. No, there's not going to be one person who says, well, the rational thing is to draw the line here and draw the line there and so forth. It's going to be organic. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to be messy. We've seen this before in human history many, 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 many times. Okay? I'm not just inventing some science fiction theories here. I am simply reflecting on the obvious lessons of history. Okay? And there's a lot of competing rival factions that are everybody's trying to figure out what to do, when to jump, where to go, all this sort of thing. I'm sure you've seen the reports about so many rich people buying homes in New Zealand because it's really far out of the way, and they figure that hopefully people will leave them alone there. Personally, I think they're more likely to end up being invaded by China. But you never know. I mean, I thought that Europe was totally ideal 20 some years ago. I had no idea that Angela Merkel was going to invite a million Muslims to show up. Try and Speak says, what are some things that weak millennial men can do to unfuck themselves? Lift weights, get in shape, stop being a coward, start looking to get married and build families. Figure out what you have to do it. Let's see. Got a couple more questions here. Ironside Bear says, just ordered a Throne of Bones. I would love to see you thoroughly dismantle Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire. Oh, I can do that. We can do that. No question. Duralex Sedlex says the days awaiting us in the U.S. are the days that Sabaton writes songs about. That's true. What we choose to do these days will be sung about centuries later. I think that history is going to look on us as one of the stupidest civilizations of all time. Nuclear Pizza said, "It's hard for me to see how marriage in the U.S. is wise when there's no nation people left and the future is war and famine. I can't even afford it." You'll figure out how to afford it. People did it in the past without any money. You need to stop trying to play along with the assumptions and the rules. Drew M says, Italy is already going to the mattresses with the migrants. Well, yeah, we all love Santo Salvini, Santo Matteo. That's why I laugh when people say, "Oh, Europe is finished." It's like they have far fewer immigrants. The immigrants don't even make a pretense of fitting in, and they're already actively and avowedly nationalist and electing nationalist leaders. I wish the United States was reacting as strongly as the European nations are. Would you recommend getting an Eastern European wife, Vox? No, unless you're Eastern European. Fix your own people. Do you not understand that women look to their men to provide leadership? I mean, do you think that Space Bunny's politics just happen to miraculously be rather similar to mine? That's the natural state of a relationship between a man and a woman. The problem is that all the soy boys are afraid to tell the women that they're interested in, look, you're absolutely wrong and your views are not acceptable and you need to change. Just try telling a woman that sometime. You will be surprised at how positively she or one of her friends will respond to you. A lot of you guys have it totally backwards. You think that, oh, well, maybe if I tell them what they already believe, then they'll like me better. They won't. They'll have contempt for you. Hi, Vox. Do you think the John Birch Society is a good source for research? Thanks. We appreciate your streams. It's better than most. But, I mean, honestly, I don't pay much attention to modern stuff. I learn more by reading about the events of 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and seeing the patterns that are playing out today than I do by reading the inevitably biased accounts of people trying to interpret things today. So, let's see. JNYC says, I'm female and have been surrounded by betas my whole life. No wonder I had to become an alpha. Girls want strong men, for fuck's sake. Exactly. That's what I'm telling you. And, it's you just have to, I mean, let me give you an example. When I was dating Space Bunny, we went to a bookstore and she had something political on her checks, something that I totally disagreed with. And the woman at the Barnes and Noble store, because we would go there and pick up books every Friday night, said, oh, nice checks. And I snorted audibly. And the woman said, what? You don't agree with that? And I said, no, not at all. And I was just, openly dismissive of it. And she starts telling me, well, you're a bad person and blah, 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 and all this sort of thing. And I just looked at her calmly and said, would you please ring up my books so I can pay for them? And it was kind of funny because, Space Bunny was kind of cracking up, and we walk out and she says, so do you get that sort of thing a lot? And I said, yeah, pretty much. I said, it's no big deal. I said, I mean, honestly, what the hell do I care about what some, chick who barely has enough education to get a job, at the ringing up at the register of a Barnes and Noble. And, she laughed. She wasn't angry at me for not agreeing with her. I don't know that my putting the cash register chick in her place helped me in her eyes or not, but it certainly didn't hurt. So if you're trying to please a woman by buttering her up, you are going about it all wrong. Be yourself. Stand up for your beliefs. Impose your beliefs. And people will follow you. Joey Gyron says, love the stream and am excited to have caught you live. Welcome. You're absolutely right about women will respect and change to your views as long as you keep to your morals. That's right. You can't be a hypocrite. Women can sense, they will forgive your weaknesses. They'll forgive your failures, but you can't be a hypocrite about it. You have to actually believe what you say you believe. And then you have to put it into practice. And then they will be inclined to follow you. But if you're just talking one game and playing another and stuff, yeah, they'll dismiss you and disrespect you and all that. Boingo Bear says, hi Vox, what do you think about the Trudeau scandal? I think it's great, and I hope that he gets kicked out hard. Is there any hope for Canada left? Probably not. Half Witty says, I would be interested in your refutation of Sargon's latest free speech video if you think this would be a valuable use of your time. It would not be, because Sargon's not very smart. Let's put it this way. Given that I am able to successfully critique and dismantle the arguments for free speech that are put forward by the historical champions of free speech, if you've seen the run-in between Sargon and me on Twitter, you'll understand why I have no interest whatsoever in anything that he might have to say about things like that. I don't dislike Sargon, heck, he was one of the people I dedicated SJW's Always Lie to. He's an old Gamergator. So I'll always be positively inclined towards him for that reason. But, he's not on my level. It's not even close. And I wouldn't take anything that he says of that sort seriously. I know that he's kind of trying to push the whole public intellectual thing, but, it's just kind of funny. John Yossarian says, Sargon didn't even read Locke. I'm not even surprised. Not even a little bit. Let's see. Will Pepe said, should one search for a woman first or pursue a house with a large fence around it? I don't see why you can't do both at the same time. I mean, the thing is that you need to, if you want to win the war, if you want to win the battle for civilization, you need to build strong families. That's got to be your objective. That's got to be your goal. It's kind of interesting. I was actually thinking about this recently. I was out at the, the market, and um, Little Barnes, Fox, you've been sleeping late. You seem a bit tired. It's 3 a.m. Of course I'm tired. you know. Anyhow, um, it was interesting because there was a woman, and she wasn't, she wasn't striking or anything. She was cute. Um, certainly wouldn't compare favorably to Space Bunny or anything. But I thought it was kind of interesting because I was thinking, you know what? That woman is like the ideal average. I mean, you could literally see this woman standing next to anyone from Brad Pitt or George Clooney to some dorky looking guy, and the guy would not be embarrassed or ashamed to be with her. And that got me thinking that a lot of men make the mistake of trying to aim their sights too high and focusing only on physical attractiveness rather than thinking about the whole package. You're much better off to, because men are pretty simple. There's basically the line. There's women you're attracted to, and there's women you're not attracted to. And the thing is, as long as she is above the line, that's all that matters on that side. If you're one of those guys who is pointing to, a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model and saying, "Oh, I'd never go out there. Her elbows are pointy. 2 out of 10 would not bang." It's your mindset is so wrong that you can't even the line is a dot to you. Let's see this. Meeting a girl that wants a family instead of dogs might be a challenge for young people. No, you have it wrong. A girl who loves dogs is a girl who wants a family. It's the ones with cats that you have to be aware of. You have to be careful about. But just ask Owen. Both Owen and I got married to girls that we bonded with over dogs. A single girl who has a dog is a girl who wants to get married, as a general rule. So, Bob the Builder, I do not exist for you. I don't care. What about me is not ever a valid question here. I mean, yeah, if you ask it in the super chats, I will answer it just because I'm obliged to. But that is not what we're talking about. Civilizational level issues here. Okay? I'm sure some of you are disappointed because I'm not, throwing stones at the Jews because I consider them to be the proximate cause of the decline of the U.S. empire. But you know what? A, it's not just that. And B, if it wasn't that, it would be something else. Okay? Every single empire has always collapsed. Every single one. And so, we're not talking about a single group of people. We're not talking about me. We're not talking about you. We're talking about this very large scale societal, civilizational issues. And I'm using some of these examples to help you put it in perspective. But it's not relevant. And I understand that I mean, I'm mixed race myself. I'm an American Indian, and I'm of, English and Irish descent. What do? The people, whoever accepts you. That's the core point. The people who genuinely accept you are the people that you should seek to be around. Nobody is testing your DNA to make sure that you have the right to live next door to them. Now, maybe in the future there will be societies like that, but that doesn't exist today. So, anyhow, well, thanks for tuning in. I know we were kind of all over the place here, but that's the way that it goes. And so, when you let's see, LRN News says the majority of Western women are horrible, and I don't even have high standards. This is the reality that we young men are dealing with. I'm not saying that good women don't exist. Degeneracy is rampant. It's not as rampant as you think. And also, you can make people better. I'm not talking about missionary dating. I'm not talking about fixing people. But I'm talking about, unless you're perfect yourself, you're not going to find anyone perfect. And so, don't let the perfect ideal become the enemy of the good. Anyhow, that's enough for tonight. I'm sure we will address this issue more in the future. Thanks for tuning in. And before I go, make sure that you, or if you're interested, I put up a hour and 18-minute sample of the Missionaries audiobook. It's awesome. You will definitely find it amusing, and I'd encourage you to check it out. It's also up here on the Darkstream. So have a good evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you the next time. I'm Vox Day. This is the Darkstream.